It starts with a question that sounds like it belongs in a sci-fi novel, not a history book. Is the God of the Bible, the singular, all-powerful deity worshipped by billions today, actually a misunderstood alien warlord from ancient Sumeria? If you spend enough time on the weird corners of the internet, you will inevitably hit this theory. It claims that Yahweh is actually one of the Anunnaki, a group of extraterrestrial colonizers who genetically engineered humanity as a slave race. It's a thrilling narrative. It combines ancient mystery with modern paranoia. But here is the catch. The true story of where Yahweh came from is actually stranger, more complex, and far more documented than any ancient alien fan fiction. We don't need spaceships to find the shocking truth. We just need to look at the dirt. Tonight, we are going to dig through the actual archaeological record, from the shattered fragments of black basalt in Jordan to the scandalous pottery shards in the Sinai desert. We are going to separate the internet myths from the historical reality. Because the question isn't whether Yahweh was an alien. The real question, the one that makes theologians nervous, is this: who was Yahweh before he became the one true God? First, we have to perform a little demolition work. We need to dismantle the Anunnaki myth so we can see the history clearly. If you Google Anunnaki, you are going to see images of guys in spacesuits holding pine cones and watches. You will read that the word translates to those who from heaven to earth came. That translation is everywhere. It is also completely wrong. In the actual Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the clay tablets written in cuneiform thousands of years ago, the word Anunnaki doesn't mean ancient astronauts. It refers to the princely seed, or the offspring of An, the sky god. These weren't flesh and blood miners from a planet called Nibiru. They were cosmic concepts given form. They were the judges of the underworld, the architects of destiny, the terrifying council that decided when a city should fall or when a flood should wipe out mankind. They were gods in the most traditional, terrifying sense. So where did the alien story come from? It all traces back to one man in the 1970 seconds, Zecharia Sitchin. He looked at these poetic, religious texts and decided to read them as literal, technical manuals. He claimed to see rockets where scholars saw temples. He saw genetic engineering where historians saw creation myths. Academically, his work is considered pseudo-archaeology. It's a modern fantasy projected onto ancient history. There is zero linguistic evidence, none that the Sumerians believed their gods came from another planet to mine gold. So, if Yahweh wasn't a Sumerian space lord, where did he come from? The Bible introduces him famously in the book of Exodus. Moses is in the desert, he sees a burning bush, and God reveals his personal name, Yahweh. But archaeology has found a breadcrumb trail that predates Moses, and it leads us away from Israel, deep into the hostile deserts of the south. We have to travel to a temple in Soleb, in what is now Sudan. This was built by the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III around 1400 BCE. On the columns of this temple, the pharaoh carved a list of his enemies, a catalog of the people he had crushed or wanted to crush. Among these hieroglyphs is a phrase that stops archaeologists in their tracks: the land of the Shasu of YHW. Let's unpack that. Shasu was the Egyptian word for the Bedouin nomads, the wanderers who lived in the wilderness east of the Nile. And YHW? That is the unmistakable hieroglyphic rendering of the name Yahweh. This inscription is centuries older than the Kingdom of Israel. It tells us that before Yahweh was the God of Jerusalem, he was the God of the nomads. He was a deity of the wild, untamed desert, worshipped by tribes moving through the regions of Midian and Edom. This aligns with a controversial academic theory known as the Kenite hypothesis. It suggests that the Israelites didn't invent Yahweh, they adopted him. The theory goes that as the southern nomadic tribes moved north, they brought their fierce warrior storm god with them, and eventually he was introduced to the people who would become Israel. The Bible even preserves memories of this. Ancient poetic passages describe Yahweh not coming from heaven, but marching out of the south, from Edom and Seir, the earth trembling as he steps. But when Yahweh arrived in the land of Canaan, he wasn't the only God in town. And this is where the history gets messy and fascinating. The ancient Israelites were not originally monotheists. They didn't wake up one day and decide there was only one God. They emerged out of the Canaanite culture, and that culture was full of gods. The boss of the Canaanite pantheon was a figure named El. He was the kindly, aging father figure, the creator deity, and initially Yahweh and El were separate. But over centuries, something like a corporate hostile takeover happened. Yahweh began to absorb El's resume. He took El's title, El Shaddai. He took El's wife. He took El's position as the head of the council. Yahweh essentially merged with El, becoming the supreme authority. But he didn't stop there. He had to deal with the competition. The biggest rival was Baal, the young, dynamic storm god who brought the rain. The Bible is full of stories of prophets fighting the priests of Baal. We usually read these as good versus evil. But historically, it was a battle for market share. Yahweh and Baal had the same job description. They both rode the clouds. They both controlled the weather. They both promised fertility. For centuries, the Israelites were torn. Do we worship Yahweh? Do we worship Baal? Or, as many likely did, do we worship both just to be safe? And then there is the scandal of the goddess. If you grew up in Sunday school, you were taught that God is a solitary masculine figure. But in the 1,970 seconds, archaeologists exploring a remote outpost in the Sinai desert called Kuntilet Adrud found something that shattered that image. They discovered a storage jar from the 8th century BCE, covered in drawings and inscriptions. The text was a blessing. It read, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." His Asherah. A possessive pronoun that changes everything. Asherah was the great mother goddess of the Canaanites. These inscriptions suggest that for a significant period of history, the Israelites didn't just worship Yahweh alone. They believed he had a consort, a wife. The Bible writers hated this. They spent pages railing against the Asherah poles and demanding they be chopped down. But the fact that they had to scream so loud about it proves one thing. The people loved her. Monotheism wasn't the default. It was a hard-fought revolution imposed from the top down. We even have a voice from the other side of the battlefield. In 1868, a missionary in Jordan found a massive slab of black basalt. This is the Mesha Stele. It was written by the king of Moab, a neighbor and enemy of Israel. In this stone, the king brags about defeating Israel. He credits his victory to his god, Chemosh. But then he says something incredible. He boasts about looting the temple of Yahweh and dragging Yahweh's sacred vessels before Chemosh. This is the oldest mention of Yahweh outside the Bible, and it shows us exactly how the ancient world worked. It wasn't about my God exists and yours is fake. It was my God is stronger than yours. Yahweh was seen as a national deity fighting for his people, just as Chemosh fought for Moab. It was a cosmic wrestling match played out through human warfare. So, let's circle back to the beginning. Was Yahweh an Anunnaki? No. The evidence just isn't there. But was he influenced by the Mesopotamian world? Absolutely. The biblical writers were not living in a bubble. They were breathing the same cultural air as the Babylonians and Sumerians. That is why the story of Noah's Ark looks almost identical to the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. That is why the imagery of Yahweh's divine council looks just like the assembly of the Anunnaki. The biblical authors took the dominant myths of their time, the pop culture of the ancient world, and they remixed them. They stripped out the polytheism, they removed the petty politics of the gods, and they used those familiar story structures to paint a portrait of a new kind of God. A God who wasn't just a force of nature, but a moral judge. The real story of Yahweh is the story of evolution. It is the journey of a storm god from the southern deserts who moved north, conquered the Canaanite pantheon, married and then lost a goddess, defeated his rival Baal, and was eventually elevated by his followers into the sole creator of the universe. It is a story of survival. Of all the gods in that ancient neighborhood, Chemosh, Milcom, Baal, Marduk, only one is still worshipped by billions of people today. And that, perhaps, is the strangest twist of all.